two, three, one, two, three. One, two, three, all come to tea. I love the shape that feels up your eyes. You are the thing that makes me feel alive. All around, we live in circles, we live in cycles. All around, we live in circles, we live in cycles. All around, she lives in circles, she lives in cycles. All around, we live in circles, we live in cycles.
Welcome to the 3% Podcast, an occasional podcast brought to you by Open Letter at the University of Rochester. I am Chad Post from Open Letter Books, and I'm joined this week by Lori Feathers. Hey, Lori, how are you doing?
I'm great, Chad. Thanks.
Thanks for coming on. So for anyone who doesn't know, Lori, I'm going to read your bio straightforward as it is, and then we'll talk. Lori Feathers is a writer and podcaster in Dallas, Texas, and co-owner, founder of Interrobang Books, where she is the store's book buyer. She co-hosts a critically acclaimed books podcast, Across the Pond, is founding chair of the Republic of Consciousness Prize U.S. and Canada, a prize which honors the work of small publishers, and co-creator of the Inside Literary Prize for Incarcerated Persons. For 6 years, she served on the elected board of the National Book Critics Circle, and what she left off of her bio is the thing that she's going to be here to talk about today. So, Lori, first of all that's wonderful, but you're on here because we want to talk about Marguerite Young. And specifically, want to talk about your Substack, Involutions of the Seashell, which is a very interesting project that we'll get into, but revolves around the reading and discussion and talking about reading and discussing Miss MacIntosh, My Darling, the 1,300-page tome that was written by Marguerite Young, published in 1965, and most recently reissued by Delkey Archive Press in a single gigantic volume. So you're here to talk about that. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and sorry that that's not on my bio. The Substack is something that's, I guess we started around end of April 2024, and I just need to update my bio.
Well, you do a lot of things. I mean, you do a lot of things, and that's that we could get into all of that, like the prizes, the podcast, everything else, the National Book Critics Circle, all of that. But really, when we were talking, we really wanted to get something down on a podcast that people can hear about what it is you're doing in the project, but also like hopefully give people a way to start talking about how to get into this gigantic, intimidating book. So I would suspect that 90% of the people listening to this podcast are familiar with Miss MacIntosh, My Darling. But if they're not, do you want to give just like a general overview of what this is and who Marguerite Young is?
Well, Marguerite Young was a Midwesterner. She was born in Indianapolis, and she had a very brilliant career as a writer. She lived most of her life in New York City and was pals with a lot of famous people. It's almost unbelievable how unrecognizable her name is among the pantheon of writers of the mid-20th century today.
It's interesting that you say that, because like one of the things going through for this podcast, I went through the website. Where's the website not on here? Oh, Marguerite Young, margueriteyoung.site. So if anyone's looking, we'll link to that. But amazing name for a website. And was going through like all of like her history, her background, because like I knew bits and pieces, but like everything kind of comes and goes in my mind already. But also this book is like impossible to like, conceive of as a whole. And to be honest, this is the only book I've ever been involved with publishing that I've not read in full. Like I read probably 100 pages of it throughout as we were doing the proofing process. And at some point was like, when it's available as a book, I'm going to read it as a book or as an ebook. I cannot hold the sheaf of papers anymore. And that was 3 years ago. So like the time lapse has been huge. But in looking through like her biographical sketch, like we talk about her as like a truly like kind of overlooked writer, someone that didn't get the sort of attention that she deserved. And yet there was a lot of attention paid to the book. And also she was given like a lot of different really great like positions, awards, honors. Like she was known quantity at that point in time, which I think is more of a testament to like where art in terms of literature was in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s versus where it is in 2024, maybe. But she did have a remarkable life, like teaching at the University of Iowa. She's John Gardner's mentor. Like that seems like a bizarre thing to say, and is such a high praise for someone. And yet you're right. Like up until this came back out. Actually, I would say up until the Paris Review article by Megan came out, it was like kind of a I've heard about it, but don't really know who she is. Just that it's a big something important kind of thing.
Yeah. Um, she, I can't really explain why she's not better known. All I can do is urge everyone to go out there and read her, and I think you'll understand that she's a fantastic writer. Um, the project that I've got going on with two other writers, Tara Cheeseman and Anthony Garrett on Substack, is a project where we talk about the book in an epistolary manner, and we're calling it a collective criticism rather than a collaborative criticism because we just sit down individually in our homes and write off a letter to the other two participants and share it on Substack. And we can go at it from all different angles. There's so many things to talk about with this book. I fell in love with this book because of the style of the writing. Um, I've kind of taken on a little project of my own, kind of looking or trying to look and read a lot of different works that to me embody this aesthetic appeal to an abundant style of writing. There are a number of examples that we can talk about that I think kind of hit it, but no book that I've found to date in the English language is an exemplar like Miss MacIntosh, my darling. I mean, if you wanted to find a book that is written in a exuberant, opulent, abundant style, this is it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is. I think it's in Megan's intro where one of the opening paragraphs is describing Farrah's dress has like 50 different sports and all these different things, and it just like is an and more and more and more, and things sort of shift and they're not always quite real, and you can move on and off. It's very abundant, very, very, very excessive in that sense, but not excessive in like the negative sort of connotation of like male excess, but in terms of like a kind of imaginative excess, I think, or abundance.
Yeah.
Abundance is better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to make sure that in writing about the book on the Substack that, of course you can say, oh yeah, obviously it's an abundant book. It's 1,300 pages, but there are really slim books that I think fall into an abundant style of writing. So it's not about the page numbers here.
Mhm.
It's just the manner of the prose. And in doing some reading about Marguerite Young, um, you know, she wrote in all kinds of different genres. She wrote poetry, she wrote nonfiction, and then this big, wonderful novel. But she always emphasized that she saw all of her work as kind of one big project, and she really didn't think that her style changed no matter which genre she was working in.
Yeah, I was gonna say I've got a quote that's exactly it's probably the same thing you read from the Delkey publication Marguerite Young, Our Darling, by Miriam Fuchs and Ellen Friedman. They interviewed her in 1988 at Tiffany's coffee shop, which is apparently the only place that Marguerite Young would meet people or go to, which is kind of amazing. And they ask her about this of like there are huge long intervals. Do they represent between your works? Do that represent major changes in the direction of your thought? She's like, no, all the books I've written have been one book from the beginning. The first poem I ever wrote about loss when I was 5 years old expressed the themes of everything I would ever write. And then goes on to say, like, these poems are relate to that. Then Angel in the Forest, examining the 19th century communities of Father George Rapp and Robert Owen's social experiments in New Harmony, Indiana. It's about abandoned utopias. I would say that my theme has always been one of Paradise Lost, always the lost cause, the lost leader, the lost utopia. So yeah, so seeing it as like one big long through the Eugene Debs book, Harp Song for a Radical being the last one that she did, that came out after she died. But they all do revolve around some form of loss or abandoned something, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, and you only have to read the first paragraph of the Eugene Debs book to know that like this isn't a standard bio that she's writing here. It's written in a very kind of digressive, windy, kind of a positive, contradictory kind of way that's it's just kind of a unique style all of her own, I think.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. It's very compelling. Like you say, like there is like an abundance. There's a sort of slippery, not slipperiness is the wrong word, but like it's such a hallucinogenic quality to reading that like it's easy to get lost in. I think there's a remark from Megan as well in her Paris Review piece of like you sort of get lulled into like a theta state of like things are just kind of going by and like they're hard to process. But once you read or click in at all, it's very compelling and it's very like easy to get sucked in and to read and read and read. And there's so much of a world to be lost in all of her books, but Miss MacIntosh, most relevantly and most largely. How did you find out about her?
I think that I found out about her when I heard that you guys were going to reissue Miss
Yeah,
MacIntosh, My Darling. And
yeah,
I actually went out online uh, and bought the 2-volume
yeah.
Heartgourd Embrace
Ooh.
edition of Miss MacIntosh, and I started reading it. I read like the first 300 pages, and then I put it down to wait for your reissue to come out. But I mean, it didn't take me long at all to get hooked because you're absolutely right that um, you instantly kind of get into the rhythm of the writing, and there's not, you know, although this book is big, it is not a difficult book. I think a
Right.
lot of times we think of, okay, the big 20th century postmodern novels, the systems novels. There's going to be like a lot of weird ideas and concepts, and they're going to try to shove everything but the kitchen sink into the two covers of the book. This is basically a story about a girl that grew up in a really messed up house with a single mother, drugged out on opium, who never got out of her bed, who really only has one kind of semi-sane influence in her life. That's a neighbor, Mr. Spitzer, who is in love with her mother, unrequited love. And he decides this kid really needs a mentor because she's not going to end up okay. And so he hires this nanny, this woman to come live in the house and teach her. And it's Miss MacIntosh, this woman that really, in a lot of ways, couldn't be more uh, different than her mother.
It's like the common sense versus the hallucinatory.
Yes.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. One of the things from her background where her grandmother that she lived with, her and her sister lived with, sister, brother, I think it was sister, lived with was also like had a stroke and was like bedridden for a good part of her life. So they took care of her. But she would also like be in and out talking about the angels in the house and the various spirits and like all sorts of like really wild things that seemed so fitting within this book. Like not to make a connection between anyone's like biography and their writing, but like that does seem to fit very, very well.
Well, she's, I think, admitted in some interviews, or did so that she had a job once, and it was sitting with this woman that she kind of referred to as the opium lady, who was always drugged out, and she would sit there at her bedside and read to her, but oftentimes she would just like listen to all of this stuff that came out of this woman's head. And her grandmother also was a big influence, though. You're right, Chad, because her grandmother, I think, if I recall correctly, saw a lot of visions or people, or thought that
Yeah.
things were people from the past were talking to her, and that seemed to be something that happened in Marguerite Young's life as well. The my favorite anecdote of that is that she talks about when she was teaching at Iowa, she would just kind of proclaim like, oh, the ghost of Charles Dickens has just walked in the door, and you pretend like there was a conversation going on. But she also had visions of Henry James, like looking over her shoulder, telling her, like, you're the continuation of like my writing project. You're writing what I started and now you're continuing. And so she definitely has had an outsized imagination.
So this is from Alan Clark. His remembrance is when he went to see her in the 90s. So towards the end of her life at Tiffany's again, of course. It brings his copy of Miss MacIntosh. She signs it. She had been ill and had been in St. Vincent's. And he asked her how she was doing, and she says, well, it hadn't been a loss because Mark Twain had come to visit her. This raised fears for her mental condition, but she continued the story saying, quote, I asked him why he'd come, and he said to tell me that dying was nothing to fear, that it was very easy and pleasant. Well, she said, easy for you. You died rich and famous. I have nothing. Oh, he replied, Marguerite, if you only knew how well your books are received in heaven. Emily Dickinson just finished Miss Mackintosh and loved every word, and Virginia Woolf is halfway through and can't put it down. It's
I
a
love that.
pretty amazing anecdote to like have out there. So the one thing before you get into too many of those stories about her, because there's a really great article or entry on this website from 1999 from Stephen Moore, the former Dalkey editor, that did a lot of books, including this one, that has a really interesting history about how the book came to be and some stuff like that that I'd like to bring up. But before we get into that, with what you're doing with Involutions of the Seashell, is your intent to get more people to be reading this book? And how do you see people reading and approaching this book in 2024? And how do you see the Substack playing into that sort of idea?
Yes, the goal definitely is to get more people reading this book. And we debated when we were thinking about starting this project, whether we needed to like do a reading schedule, or, kind of some kind of pacing. And this book is a little challenging in that respect for a number of reasons. One, that you, when you're making your way through the chapters, you're often going back and revisiting something that's happened in a previous chapter. There's a lot of, I like to say repetition, but not redundancy, because everything is, has a different um, kind of prism to it every time she approaches the same subject. But there's not a traditional plot really that you're following much, other than the fact that Vera is now a grown woman and she's trying to find her long lost nanny, Miss MacIntosh, who disappeared. Um, Also, the text is so dense and wordy that we were really afraid that if we put a reading schedule, we were going to lose people right away, because maybe they would jump on and they would try to keep with us, and then they would soon feel like, oh, I just don't have time to keep up. So we are going through the Substack in kind of a chronological order by pages and chapters, but we're talking a lot more about different different stylistic elements, different influences, themes, the way that she uses metaphor, the way a lot of her prose, kind of sounds like poetry. the way that sometimes she'll write something in a way that you will imagine that you know what she's talking about, and then she'll invert it. So she's talking about the very opposite. She does that a lot with gender.
Mhm.
She does that a lot with light and dark. And there's a lot of doppelgangers in this book. So you'll meet there aren't many characters, only, about a handful, maybe 10,
Right.
probably less than a dozen. But you'll see them and you'll pretty instantly recognize that, oh, the way she's describing that person is just the opposite of this other person, or she's describing them a little bit similarly. So there's a lot of that kind of split identity thing going on as well.
Really interesting. Yeah, I was gonna ask if you wanted to read one of your entries. If there's one that you'd like to point to as an example, because I think that one thing that's maybe that I really want to emphasize or try and bring to the forefront here is that in contrast to what you would think of as a sort of like reading guide or going along with the book or group reading sort of thing, what you're all seem to be doing is a little bit different than that, a little bit more like reflective about like the book, but also about kind of the processing of the book, and is more it's more like you could take these pieces outside of even reading Miss MacIntosh and look at them as like, here's like a sort of meditation on reading and on understanding in some sense of like, especially within a project, reading a giant book that tends to be very solitary. And like, how do you communicate about something so grand and so like amorphous and has all these kind of splits and parallels to it? How do you convey like what you like about that and what how it's impacting you when it is of this kind of nature, of this like this sort of like the amorphous is probably the best word, nature. And I think that that's really interesting that the project kind of exists on its own, connected or parallel to the book as well. And so some of the pieces are very poetic.
Well, I'm happy to read my latest
Do it.
letter that's been posted. Okay. I posted this on October 7th, um, and you can find it on Substack. Here it goes. Dear Tara and Anthony, as I continue to make my way through a rereading of Chapter 6, I'm compelled to write about another aspect of Jung's prolific inclusions and cyclonic repetitions, the lexical contradictions present on almost every page, including those in Chapter 6. You will recall from my previous post that in this chapter, we find pregnant Madge on the bus with her new husband, Homer, and our heroine, Vera Cartwheel. While Homer sleeps and Vera looks on, Madge is assaulted by images of her romanticized past and her almost inconceivably dismal future as wife and mother. Certainly, Madge's identity crisis is profound. Who is she to Homer? The thin dancing girl, so light and free, prior to her pregnancy and marriage? Who is her rival for Homer's affection? Her former dancing girl self, or the dying Jacqueline White, that old high school cheerleader? Are they one and the same? Madge is bitter and resentful of her circumstances, but at the same time, she recognizes the intractable oppositions inherent in living. Quote, she shook the powdery dust out of her coat, the dust settling back again upon her shoulders. Just in that single instant, for everything was self-contradictory, it seemed, as she was, and perhaps life must always have, so long as it is life, these double motions, like the progressions of delicate planets, circles within circles, wheels within wheels, orbs within orbs, and death should not be simple. End quote. One of the most persistent contradictions in the novel is the opposing conditions of birth and death, each seeming to precipitate renewal and demise as both points on a continuum and also simultaneously existing states. Madge's father always had blamed her for killing her mother by being born, just as Madge claims that she died upon being impregnated. Quote, all her life had been this poor parody of life, this sad pretense she could no longer countenance nor endure. For she was dead, and she had died at the hour of her birth. Should the dead give birth to the living? Should the child give birth to the mother? It was this feeble imitation of herself, And who was she, poor little Madge? End quote. Madge's drunken father drowns after she turns him out on a cold night, so cold it cracked the stars. He had entered her bedroom and mistaken Madge for her dead mother, telling her one minute that she was never born, the next that she was never killed. I'm not sure whether it's more accurate to say that these contradictions enhance the novel's repetitions or vice versa. However, it's clear that they work in synergistic tandem to layer the rich, digressive prose and envelop the reader within it. Anise Nin, Young's admirer and close reader, says in her introduction to the 1979 Hardcore Brace Janovich edition of Miss MacIntosh, My Darling, that the novel is a canto to obsession. And she quotes Young: to get hold of a character, I may have expanded it too much, but if I shortened it, it would not be an obsession. An obsession is what possesses people. If I removed the repetitions, I would remove one of the motifs of life itself. End quote. Surely the same can be said about any possibility of disregarding Young's many contradictions. Impossible, for within these oppositions nests the essence of life. Yours, Lori.
So I like how it is written as a letter too. Like all these are I think that these are interesting in that epistolary nature of what you're doing, where it does feel like intimate and like not lecturing. Contrast to like where you could see someone doing this being like, here's what this is important, blah 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 blah. But also like this idea of like that kind of obsession and the way that these contradictions work is something that I think says something about the book, but also about writing in general and about like the way that we think about life in general, and does seem very Henry James like in that regard too. But I think it's really interesting that like you could I haven't read this part, but I totally understand what you're talking about and really appreciate it. That makes sense.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's really hard to look at this book and not feel like, and maybe this is, I think she would say that this is the same with all of her writing. She writes like a woman possessed or obsessed. It's a torrential vomiting of words almost, but in like the very best sense, because um the words mean something. And um, especially in Miss MacIntosh, My Darling, there's so much ekphrastic writing. Like the what she's describing, that the sea blackened house, which is where Vera lives with her opium addicted mom. She explains that, describes it in such detail that you feel it. You feel the dampness of that seaside house. You feel how decrepit and beat down it is, how opulent it once was, and all of this stuff that's crammed in this house that no one has used or looked at for decades. It's just the tone of the book, I think, is one that is just really compelling.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I don't know how to exactly transition, but in terms of like the history of this book, have you read this piece that Stephen Moore wrote for whatever Marguerite Young's site?
No, I have not.
Oh, okay. So I know that there's like one of the famous things that's out there is the Paris Review interview with her is very interesting. There's an interview that is in the book that's really interesting too, and there's many, many others. They're all the other things. This is really curious because it talks about kind of the way that Delkey came to publish the book, in particular in the two volumes. And it starts with him like having heard about Margaret Young in the early 70s from Aeneas Nin's book, The Novel of the Future, where she praised Young, so on and so forth. He buys the book, never reads it, doesn't read it for a decade, right? Like, doesn't do anything with it, but then ends up working on the Review of Contemporary Fiction, where he was the copy editor for the issue on Kathy Acker, Christine Brooke Rose, and Margaret Young, which I do not have, but like is one I remember seeing. I thought I had it somewhere, but it's not on my shelf right now, so God only knows. But is like three of the most interesting female authors of the 20th century, like jammed together. I don't know if you know Kathy Acker or Christine Brooke Rose, but they are very much like this is a very good selection, right? So he immediately starts reading the book for that reason, falls in love with it, and this is I like this this phrase related to how we've been describing it. He says, I immediately fell in love with it. I've always liked big, ambitious books and have a penchant for what some people denigrate as, quote, purple prose. Needless to say, no one's prose is purpler than Marguerite's. He goes on about that for a second. He then finds out that there's, around the same time in the early 90s, he got a call from Oxford University Press. The guy was a huge fan of Young's, knew her, knew about the special issue on her, and asked if they would be interested in reprinting Miss MacIntosh. So it comes to him from this outside way. Now, what's super fun is that he didn't know it was out of print, thinks it's great, goes to meet her, and the meeting with her is amazing. So like this sort of encapsulates like everything I've ever heard in rumors and like side notes. Everything is like right here where she says, so he goes to, he's like, yes, I'd love to. He's got a lot of, takes a lot of like stray shots at John O'Brien throughout this whole piece, like mini, and it's kind of, which is also like part of the texture and fun of this. So he tells the Oxford guy, of course, I'd love to meet him. At that time, Delkey's editor, John O'Brien, trusted my judgment on such matters, even though Young wasn't his type of author. So I called Marguerite, the friend had supplied her phone number, and sure enough, she agreed. The business part of our conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but she spent about an hour talking about everything else under the sun, especially people she knew and who admired her work. She was rather vain in this regard. She made sure I knew she was descended from Brigham Young, relayed how her dear friend Sal Bellows' opinion of her work, so on and so forth. I told her that Dalkey didn't have much money to pay for an advance, especially considering the astronomical printing bill that would result, but she said she'd waive the advance as long as we agreed to publish it the way she wanted, in 2 volumes. I balked at this because I preferred one big book, like the original edition, but she insisted. She said the 1 volume edition intimidated people, scared them off. She wanted something more portable, something people could read on the subway. She was very insistent. In fact, said she'd withdraw her offer to us to let us, or withdraw her offer to let us publish it otherwise. So I relented. In fact, she told me she regretted waiting until the entire novel was finished before publishing it. She wished she had published it in shorter installments throughout the 50s and 60s, the way British authors do, like Anthony Poole's Dance to the Music of Time, Lawrence Durrell's Quartet and Quintet, Doris Lessing's Martha Quest series and Sci-Fi Quintet. I remember the title she would have used for the final Esther Longtree section was Mule. Miss MacIntosh contains many novellas within it. It's interesting to speculate how her reputation might have been different had she published them separately, which I think is interesting because like the idea that this is something you're going to bring on a subway is equally like I'm holding up the volume 2 is like still like a massive tome to like just carry around, but like nevertheless like I get the point. Like
Yeah, half the book is is too big for the subway as well. Since we started this Substack, I've done some domestic travel and had to carry in my suitcase the
oh
whole
no.
big 1 volume bomber, and it takes up a lot of room.
It sure does. Like it's one of the things that like honestly, I think Tara mentioned this on your Substack too, but like I am an ebook like advocate for myself because my eyesight and whatnot. But like also like trying to hold this thing up in bed is like a beast. Like this is the least comfortable sort of thing to hold on to. But nevertheless, it's great. There's one other really funny thing. So he goes back to New York City in 1992. So he goes to meet her again. She never signed the contract that he sent to her. So he brings another one. He's like, okay, since Marguerite never signed it, I brought another one along and had it sign her there. She couldn't remember her social security number, and after digging around in her purse, came up with what later turned out to be her dentist's phone number. Which might be why when I looked at the contract when we were talking about this the other day, I was like, this is a bizarre social security number. This has like a letter in it and like it's not formatted right. I think that was not her social security number. I think that was the dentist number. But then she gives him photos, so on and so forth. They then print it as the 2 volumes, and it was going to be part of like a 3-book series, which was Miss MacIntosh Inviting the Muses, which is this book about her, and then the reprint of Angel in the Forest, which is also forthcoming as a Delkey Essentials, I think next month. I think November of 2024. That will be out. And that is also for anyone who, if Miss MacIntosh for one reason or another is intimidating, or you just want to take a break from it. You're reading it and you're like into it, but you want to like veer for a minute. Angel in the Forest is also really good. It's about New Harmony, Indiana, and about 2 different utopias that were there. One that was like this German religious utopia that was like highly functional, and very successful in many ways because they made liquor, made whiskey, and sold it to all the surrounding people. So they had cash. But part of their religious belief was that you couldn't have sex like at all. And so like no there are no new people in their utopia. They sort of like they could only get new members by like recruiting people who wanted to come and not have sex. So like that's not how cults usually work or like or like utopias. In fact, like I George Rapp, the founder, he had to castrate his son because his son got a his wife pregnant, and so they castrated him, and in the course of it, killed him, I believe,
Oh
by
my
like
God.
not by cutting wrong. Like
Ugh.
but then it becomes like a socialist experiment by Owen, is it Robert Owen? And who's from Britain, and very interesting on how that would work as like a very like communal sort of place, very socialist. Problem being like nobody really followed any rules whatsoever. So like everyone just sort of became an instant freeloader. Also doesn't work. But her obsession with that kind of like failure of things is so gratifying to me. I love that. I love that in like all sorts of aspects of like this kind of quixotic idea that doesn't quite ever work, or in sports like the great quarterback who doesn't win at all. I love that kind of shit. Like I'm a sucker for it. But it's interesting that so then they do talk. He does talk a bit about this like about the Debs book, which is a whole nother story in which she claims that it's going to be like 3 volumes. It's going to be like the first volume is going to be 2,500 pages long. It was like this massive thing. Although I wonder, to be honest, we talked about this the other day, like that 2,400 page thing comes up a lot. I was very curious. I couldn't find like there's enough variation in numbers that I'm curious as to whether or not she meant the whole 3 volume set would be 2,400 pages and volume one was 800 pages or 1,000 pages and was trimmed down to like what it is now. But I'm not sure how much like was written of that.
Yeah, I don't know either, but I think it's in the introduction um, to the Debs book, it said that she worked on it like the last 2.5 decades of her
Yeah.
life.
It was a huge project. So they're quite, she also seems to have handwritten everything. So like I don't know because there's like a picture of one of the page of page 34 in here and it's handwritten. So like when we say 2,400 pages, I don't know what we're talking about, honestly.
Yeah.
Like if that's like 24 handwritten pages, 2,400 handwritten pages, like I don't know how that correlates, it could be anything. But another, I mean, giant project about a failed socialist. Like everything's like, you know, always on that tip. I love it. Love it.
Yeah.
Love it. But it's very, I think the Stephen Moore thing is super funny because I mean, he had so much contact and he did so many interesting things about all of these books and had all these great interactions with people back when publishing still was about like meeting people in coffee shops that are then like signing contracts versus like the kind of corporatized production facility that it is now, where it's like much more of a factory and less of a dream.
Yeah. Well, and he's such a great literary citizen. I reached out to him when I first started reading this book and about this aesthetic abundance in literary fiction type of project or theme that I've been thinking about, and just super kind, super generous with
Mhm.
ideas and recommendations, and yeah, he's someone that I think reading about his past experiences with authors and in publishing is really quite interesting.
I mean, he does have the book, the novel, the alternative history of the novel, which is really important and really interesting. He also has a more recent book called Delphi Days that's about his time there that has some interesting anecdotes, also a little bit of vitriol, and some good stuff about like certain authors and like how they came to be published there, which is very, to me, very interesting.
He also has a book on Alexander Thoreau, kind of
Yeah.
a critical kind of appraisal of Thoreau's work. And this is not Paul Thoreau, this is his brother Alexander, the lesser known Thoreau, but he wouldn't want to be referred to that, I'm sure. He seems to be quite a proud man, but I really enjoy his writing as well.
Yeah, yeah. There's like they did do the poems by him some years ago, Lollipop Trollops, but I know his big book, Darkenville's Cat, is still
Yes.
out of
Yeah, I
print.
read that one. It's
Oh,
good.
yeah. Yeah.
And I've read a big chunk, but not to the end of Laura Warholic, which is his
Oh,
more
right.
recent book.
Yeah. Forgot about that.
Yeah, he's got, I think, like 6 or 7 novels, and then Alexander Throw also did the he did the primary colors and the secondary colors, that
Hmm.
kind of I don't know, little nonfiction book about it's just an interesting little musing on different color throughout history and how it's been used and what it represents in literature.
I have something that I can't put out publicly about him right here, but after we finish recording, I need to remember to tell you something
Okay.
specifically about that. But anyways, so yeah, so Stephen Moore, great. The fact that Delkey did this as the 2 volumes is really interesting. I'm glad that we do have it as one, even though I think it would be cool to have it as like 4 or 5, like little, like truly pocket-sized editions of sorts. I think that would be fun. I'm a big fan of the Anthony Poole books, the whole series, and like the idea of being able to read like a 300-page book, but read 12 of them is kind of, I don't know, something about that is as addictive and fun to me. And however this would have been split up would have been very cool to like to see. But it is, I mean, it is. She's running against. I mean, we're talking about it like as kind of a neglected book, an overseen book, and part of it is that it's a female writer writing something that's excessive. Obviously, that's like plays. There's some level of like misogyny within the literary world that plays into that. Also, like she's working so far outside of time in the way that like having only a handful of books come out in your lifetime is very much not of the current moment. Like the sort of 2 decades that it takes to write a book is not something that you see very often anymore. And that also makes her like the scarcity of her books makes it more valuable, but also like the time and attention that she put into this makes it worth savoring every word and savoring the whole book in length instead of
Yeah,
just rushing through it.
but on a per pound or page count, she's quite productive.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. She's she's written a lot. It just
Right.
happens to be one.
Exactly.
But that is cool, and that is like the way that I think one should read it and should approach it is like slowly enjoy it, follow along with your Substack, so you get like insights and can sort of meditate on it instead of the go 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 rush through it. Check this off on your Goodreads, reading challenge list. It's not that sort of book. And I think that that's one of the things that really appealed to me about when we talked about redoing it as an essential is that it really is an essential Delkey book. It's a monument to something that's like very important and very interesting of like a literary scene that she was involved in, but also like the kind of the aesthetic of it. And also that it is something that goes counter to most of what our culture is about these days. And that it
Yeah.
is a book that requires you to be slow.
I don't know many. I think with one exception, anyone that's just reading only Miss MacIntosh, my darling. It's the
Yeah.
kind of thing because it the way it's written, it actually honors the fact that you can be reading multiple things at the same time. You're not going to get lost in the
Hmm.
narrative, really. You're not going to say, oh, I don't remember who this character is because it's the same characters over and over again.
Yep.
And there's not a lot of traditional action in the book. So I do know one person who said that they read it in 30 days and nothing else. And I can't even imagine. It's but I think it works really great. And the way that I'm reading it is just, savoring it, not a race to get to the end. This Substack that we're doing is about a year-long project. And so if you're listening out there, you don't need to feel like, oh, I'm starting too late. Uh, I missed the bus. No pun intended, because there's a very long bus ride on this.
Yeah. Goes in
on
circles and
this-
circles and circles.
Right. Yeah, and our bus goes in circles too. So you'll be fine. Don't worry
Yeah.
about it. Jump on.
Yeah, absolutely. And you don't, yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think that that's the best way to do it. And with Substack, everything's evergreen. You can sign on, go back to the archives, start at the beginning, see what your thoughts and musings were on each of the different sections as you read along. There's no reason to feel pressured to race ahead or to finish anything on any moment in time. One other thing related to like her sort of status, one of the lines I like was where someone's like, well, the only reason some critics said, well, the only reason she's able to write this is because she was never married. And she's like, yeah, if I was married, I would never ever have been able to do this kind of thing. She's it asked about that. She's always like, I had lots of lovers. I didn't need a husband. Like, which is
Yeah, she
great.
seemed to have a very I think I read somewhere that she would teach and then she would come home like at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and write like nonstop from like 4 to midnight, go to bed, repeat just over and over and over again. Um,
Amazing.
and then I guess when she got to New York, she would wake up and go to that diner for
Yeah.
her toast and coffee in the morning, probably and smoking. I think they said she
She
smoked a
smoked a
lot.
lot.
Yeah. And probably, writing at the same time too, and then go home and write some more. So she was definitely a dedicated person. But I think that, yeah, people should just experience her, just, find out how different she is from so many of the other novels that came out right around the same time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so there'll be a link in here, but it's missmacintosh.substack.com, Involutions of the Seashell. You can find it very easily and follow along. And aside from that, is there anything you'd like to add?
I just like to add that our Substack isn't one of those annoying ones that makes you like pay to get the full thing. It's all free.
It's all free. It's all free. Although if you want to, I assume there's a way that you can donate if you want to. I do have a Substack and I don't know how it works and I don't get into the intricacies of it. But one day someone emailed me, was like, I've been paying you $8 every month. And I was like, why the fuck are you doing that? And he's like, it just asked me to. And so I did. And I was like, $8? Like, what a bizarre. And I tried to figure out how to shut everything off. It's all free. I always make sure every post is for free things, but every so often, like, it clips up where it's like, you have a subscriber. I was like, what are you doing?
Yeah, I think like I probably have signed up for God knows how many Substack accounts, and they're all, here's the first 2.5 paragraphs, but you have to pay for the rest. I never pay for any of them.
Yeah, I do pay for Sam Miller's. He's a baseball writer that I think is like one of the smartest writers working today on anything, and the way that he thinks is brilliant. I pay him. I pay him. But outside of that, same thing. Same thing. So yeah, so it's a free Substack. You subscribe, read along, everything's there. You can access the archives without having to pay, and you can follow along, read it as it comes out, read it as you read the book. And you can get the book through Delkey's website. I'll include a link actually through bookshop.org. That's probably the easiest way to get it right now. And otherwise, like, hope you enjoyed the conversation. I love talking to you, Lori, all the time. And if you did, rate, review, share with your friends, do all the fun stuff that you do for other podcasts. And we'll be back in a few weeks with something new.
Thanks, Chad.
Thank you.
One, two, three, one, two, three, on, two, three, all come to tea.